Tony Torrino thought respect could be taken with fists. Standing in that makeshift boxing ring on a cold February night in 1955, flexing his muscles for the crowd, the young Italian enforcer believed he was about to humiliate the most feared man in Harlem. 5,000 people packed into the warehouse on the Lower East Side, money changing hands, bets being placed. The Italians were confident. Their boy was 28, strong as an ox, undefeated in 15 street fights. Bumpy Johnson was 51, just out of prison, looking older, slower. This should have been easy. But as Torrino shadowboxed in his corner, waiting for his opponent to appear, he had no idea that Bumpy Johnson had already won the fight, not with his hands, with his mind. New York City in 1955 was a chessboard where every neighborhood was a kingdom, and every kingdom had a king. The Italian families controlled the docks, the unions, the numbers in Brooklyn and the Bronx. But Harlem belonged to one man, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. They called him Bumpy because of a bump on the back of his head from a childhood fight. But by 1955, people said his name with reverence, fear, or both. Bumpy had been away for 3 years. Federal conspiracy charges, Dannemora State Prison, where winter cut through concrete walls and silence was enforced with nightsticks. While he counted days behind bars, other men had grown ambitious. Territorial lines had shifted. Young wolves had begun circling what they thought was a weakened king. Tony Iron Fist Torrino was one of those wolves. 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of muscle and arrogance, he worked enforcement for the Bonanno family. Torrino had grown up in Little Italy, hearing stories about how tough Italians controlled New York, how they were smarter, stronger, more organized than the black gangs uptown. He believed those stories. And when Bumpy walked out of Dannemora in January 1955, Torrino saw an opportunity to make his reputation by destroying a legend. The disrespect started small. Torrino's crew began collecting from numbers runners on the border between Italian and black territory. When the runners complained, Torrino would laugh. Tell them to go cry to their old boss if they could find him. Tell them the neighborhood had new management now. Word got back to Bumpy within 48 hours of his return to Harlem. He was sitting in the back booth of Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, the same booth he'd held court in for 20 years, when Willie the Clutch Henderson slid him the report. 3 runners robbed, 2 beaten, 1 hospitalized, all on 116th Street, technically neutral ground, but everyone knew it fell under Bumpy's protection. Bumpy read the report twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. His face showed nothing. No anger, no surprise, no emotion at all. That worried Willie more than shouting would have. "What you want me to do, Bump?" "Nothing," Bumpy said quietly. Yet, but Tony Torrino wasn't finished. Having tested the waters and found them apparently calm, he decided to dive deeper. On February 10th, he walked into Small's Paradise during the dinner rush. Small's was sacred ground in Harlem, the place where jazz musicians, numbers kings, and neighborhood royalty came to eat, drink, and conduct business. Torrino strolled through the restaurant like he owned it, stopping at tables, introducing himself, making it clear he was the new power in the area. He saved his boldest move for last. Walking to the back corner booth where Bumpy always sat, Torrino pulled out the chair and sat down. Right there, in Bumpy Johnson's chair. The entire restaurant went silent. Waiters stopped serving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone stared at the young Italian who had just committed what amounted to public sacrilege. Bumpy wasn't there that night, but by morning every person in Harlem knew what Torrino had done. The challenge couldn't have been clearer if he'd slapped Bumpy across the face in broad daylight. That's when Torrino made his announcement. He rented a warehouse on Houston Street, right on the border between Little Italy and the Lower East Side, had his boys set up a boxing ring in the center, then sent word through every bar, barber shop, and numbers joint in Manhattan. Tony Torrino was calling out Bumpy Johnson, mano a mano. Winner takes all the disputed territory. Loser leaves New York forever. The Italian families were skeptical at first. Torrino was acting without permission, making moves that could start a war. But Frank Bonanno saw an opportunity. If this kid could beat Bumpy Johnson in front of thousands of witnesses, it would send a message that the black gangs weren't untouchable. That Italian muscle could enforce Italian will anywhere in the city. So word went out through Italian social clubs, union halls, and family gathering places. Friday night, February 18th, Houston Street Warehouse. Come watch Tony Torrino break the King of Harlem. The black community's response was immediate and intense. This wasn't just about Bumpy anymore. This was about respect, about whether a young Italian punk could walk into their neighborhood, sit in their leader's chair, and then publicly humiliate him. Money started flowing. Bets were placed, not just on who would win, but whether Bumpy would even show up. Because at 51, having spent 3 years in prison, many wondered if Bumpy Johnson still had the fire that made him a legend. Prison changed men. Age slowed them down. Maybe Tony Torrino had calculated correctly. Maybe he was challenging a has-been. Friday morning, Bumpy Johnson sat in his apartment on Strivers Row, drinking coffee and reading 3 different newspapers. The Daily News had picked up the story. Harlem King challenged by Italian boxer. The Amsterdam News called it the fight for respect. Even the Times mentioned it in their crime roundup, though they buried it on page 12. Bumpy's wife, Mamie, watched him read in silence. Finally, she couldn't contain herself any longer. "You don't have to do this, Ellsworth. You have nothing to prove to that boy." Bumpy looked up from his paper. "It's not about proving anything to him. It's about proving something to everyone else. What if he's stronger? What if prison—" "Mamie," Bumpy interrupted gently, "what makes you think this is going to be about strength?" By 7 o'clock that evening, the warehouse was packed beyond capacity. 5,000 people had somehow squeezed into a space meant for half that number. Italian men in expensive suits occupied the north side of the building. Black men and women from Harlem filled the south side. In between stood police officers, reporters, gamblers, and curiosity seekers who had heard about the most unusual challenge in New York criminal history. The betting was heavily favored toward Torrino. The odds makers looked at age, at prison time, at the simple fact that Torrino was a trained boxer, while Bumpy was known more for his intelligence than his fighting ability. Smart money was going on the young Italian. Tony Torrino entered the warehouse at 7:30, surrounded by 6 members of his crew. He wore red boxing trunks, no shirt, his muscled torso gleaming under the harsh warehouse lights. The Italian side of the crowd roared approval. Torrino raised his gloved hands above his head, flexed his shoulders, showed off the physique that had earned him his nickname. He looked like a champion. He moved like a fighter who had never lost a battle. He climbed into the ring and began shadowboxing, throwing combinations that whistled through the air. His footwork was precise, his timing perfect. Watching him warm up, even Bumpy's supporters began to worry. This wasn't some street thug throwing wild punches. This was a trained fighter in his prime. 8 o'clock came and went. No Bumpy Johnson. 8:15. The Italian crowd began chanting, "Where is he? Where is he?" 8:20. Some of Bumpy's supporters started heading for the exits. If their man wasn't going to show, they didn't want to witness his reputation being destroyed by default. 8:25. Tony Torrino grabbed a microphone that had been set up for the fight announcements. "Looks like the old king is scared," he called out to the crowd. "Maybe prison broke him. Maybe he knows he can't handle a real fighter. So here's what's going to happen. Since Bumpy Johnson is too much of a coward to face me, I'm claiming victory. And starting tomorrow, 116th Street belongs to me." The Italian side of the warehouse erupted in cheers. The Harlem side stood in stunned silence. This was worse than a beating. This was humiliation without even the dignity of a fight. That's when the warehouse doors opened and Bumpy Johnson walked in. He was alone. No entourage, no crew, no backup. He wore a simple black suit, white shirt, thin black tie. No boxing gear, no athletic wear, nothing that suggested he had come to fight. His hands were empty, no gloves, no wraps, nothing. He looked like a man who had dressed for church and wandered into the wrong building. But his walk, the way he moved through that crowd of 5,000 hostile and friendly faces, each step deliberate, unhurried, confident, his eyes scanning the room, cataloging faces, calculating odds, reading the energy of the mob. This was a man who understood crowds, who knew how to control them, who had learned that presence mattered more than posture. The warehouse fell silent as Bumpy made his way toward the ring. Even the Italian supporters stopped cheering, struck by something in his demeanor that suggested they might have misjudged the situation. Torrino stopped shadowboxing and stared as his opponent approached. Bumpy reached the ring and looked up at the young Italian bouncing on his toes above him. "You wanted to talk," Bumpy said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent warehouse. "So let's talk." He climbed through the ropes, still in his suit, still wearing his street shoes, still carrying himself like a man who had come to conduct business rather than engage in violence. The crowd waited for him to change clothes, to put on gloves, to prepare for battle. Instead, Bumpy Johnson stood in the center of the ring and began to speak. "My name is Bumpy Johnson," he said, his voice projecting to every corner of the warehouse without shouting. "Some of you know me. Some of you know my reputation. Some of you think that reputation is based on fear, on violence, on being willing to hurt people who cross me." He turned in a slow circle, making eye contact with sections of the crowd, including them in his words. "That's partly true. I have hurt people. I will hurt people again if they force me to. But that's not where real power comes from. Real power comes from understanding people, from knowing what they want, what they fear, what they respect." Tony Torrino shifted nervously in his corner. This wasn't what he had expected. He had prepared for a fight, not a lecture. "This young man," Bumpy continued, pointing at Torrino, "thinks power comes from muscle, from being able to hit hard, move fast, intimidate through strength. He's not wrong. That kind of power exists, but it's temporary power, the power of youth, and youth doesn't last." The crowd was listening intently now, drawn in despite themselves by the strange spectacle of a man giving a speech in a boxing ring. "Tony Torrino challenged me tonight because he thinks I'm weak. He thinks prison broke me. He thinks age has slowed me down. He thinks if he can beat me in front of all of you, he'll inherit my respect, my territory, my authority." Bumpy smiled for the first time since entering the warehouse. It was not a pleasant smile. But respect isn't something you can take by force. Authority isn't a prize you win in a boxing match. And power, real power, doesn't come from convincing people you can hurt them. It comes from convincing them you don't need to. He walked toward Torrino's corner, still speaking to the crowd, but now focusing his attention on his opponent. "Let me tell you something about Tony Torrino that he doesn't know I know. Last month, his girlfriend Maria went to the emergency room at Bellevue Hospital. Broken ribs, bruised face, cigarette burns on her arms. She told the doctors she fell down the stairs. The doctors didn't believe her, but they couldn't prove otherwise." Torrino's face went white. "That's not... You can't..." 3 weeks ago, Tony beat up a 60-year-old numbers runner named Charlie Vespa for being $2 short on his weekly payment. Charlie's in a wheelchair now, probably permanent. The Italian side of the crowd began murmuring. These weren't the actions of a strong man defending his territory. These were the actions of a bully picking on the weak. "And last week," Bumpy continued, his voice getting quieter, forcing the entire warehouse to lean in to hear him, "Tony Torrino robbed a church collection box, St. Patrick's Cathedral, $237 meant to feed homeless children. He thought nobody saw him. He was wrong." The silence in the warehouse was now complete. 5,000 people holding their breath, watching as Bumpy Johnson systematically destroyed his opponent's reputation without throwing a single punch. Torrino tried to recover. You're lying. I never... Those are just stories. Stories, Bumpy repeated thoughtfully. Yes, they are stories. And stories matter, don't they, Tony? Because that's all reputation really is. Stories people tell about you. Stories that spread through neighborhoods, through families, through communities. He turned back to address the entire crowd. I could fight this man tonight. I could try to prove that at 51, I'm still tough enough to beat a 28-year-old boxer. Maybe I'd win, maybe I'd lose. But either way, what would that prove? That violence solves problems? That strength matters more than character? Bumpy began removing his jacket, slowly, deliberately. The crowd tensed, thinking the fight was finally about to begin. Instead, he folded the jacket neatly and set it down in a neutral corner. Or I could tell you a different story. A story about what happened 3 days ago when I found out about tonight's challenge. He began rolling up his sleeves, still speaking in that same calm, measured tone. I could have sent 20 men to this warehouse. Could have had Tony Torrino beaten unconscious before he ever stepped foot in this ring. That's what the old Bumpy Johnson might have done. The Bumpy Johnson who solved problems with violence. Both sleeves rolled up now. He stood in the center of the ring looking somehow more dangerous in his business clothes than Torrino looked in his boxing gear. But I chose a different way. I made some phone calls, had some conversations, found out some interesting things about Tony Torrino's business relationships. Torrino's face was now completely pale. He looked around desperately, seeking support from his crew, but they were staring at Bumpy with the same fascination as everyone else. It turns out Tony's been skimming money from his collections, money that belongs to Frank Bonanno, money that Frank trusted Tony to deliver honestly, about $8,000 over the past 6 months. The Italian side of the crowd erupted in angry shouts. Someone yelled, "Thief!" Others began pushing toward the ring, hands reaching for weapons. Now, I could have told Frank about this last week, Bumpy continued, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the commotion. Could have let family justice take its course, but I thought it would be more educational to share this information tonight, in front of everyone. He looked directly at Torrino, who was now backing toward the ropes, realizing that his support had evaporated in an instant. You see, Tony, you made a fundamental mistake. You thought this was about fighting. You thought if you could beat an old man in a boxing ring, people would respect you. But respect isn't about fear, it's about trust. And trust, once lost, can never be won back with fists. Frank Bonanno's men were pushing through the crowd now, their intention clear. Torrino looked around frantically for an escape route, but the ring was surrounded. I could let them take you, Bumpy said quietly, though his words carried clearly in the sudden hush. Could let them handle this the traditional way, but I'm going to make you a different offer. The advancing enforcers stopped, waiting to see what Bumpy would say. You have 10 seconds to get out of this ring, out of this warehouse, and out of New York City. Forever. If you're smart, you'll take that offer, because it's the only one you're going to get. Torrino stood frozen for a moment, looking around at 5,000 faces that had transformed from expectant to hostile in the space of a few minutes. Then, without a word, he dropped his gloves and ran. Not walked, not strutted, but ran full sprint toward the nearest exit, pushing through the crowd like a man fleeing a fire. The warehouse exploded in noise. Cheers from the Harlem side, angry shouts from the Italians, general chaos as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. But through it all, Bumpy Johnson stood calmly in the center of the ring, putting his jacket back on, straightening his tie, looking for all the world like a man who had just concluded a routine business meeting. When the noise finally died down, he spoke once more. Let me be clear about something. What happened here tonight wasn't about beating Tony Torrino. It was about showing all of you the difference between strength and power. Strength is physical, temporary. Power is understanding people, understanding systems, understanding how to win without fighting. He climbed down from the ring and began walking toward the exit, the crowd parting before him like water. Anyone else who thinks they can take what's mine through violence, remember what you saw tonight. Remember that real power doesn't need to prove itself with fists. And remember that when you challenge a king, you better make sure you understand what makes him royal. Bumpy Johnson walked out of that warehouse the same way he had walked in. Alone, unhurried, confident. But the man who left was different from the man who had entered. For 3 years, people had wondered if prison had broken the King of Harlem. Tonight, 5,000 witnesses had their answer. Within a week, the story of the boxing ring had spread through every neighborhood in New York. Not just the criminal underworld, but legitimate businesses, police precincts, newspaper offices. The story of how Bumpy Johnson had faced down a challenger without throwing a punch, had destroyed a man's reputation with nothing but words and information, had proven that intelligence was more dangerous than muscle. The Italian families called off their expansion into Harlem, not because they were afraid of Bumpy's fists, but because they realized they were outmatched by his mind. Frank Bonanno, when asked about the incident, reportedly said, "That man didn't beat Tony Torrino. He embarrassed him. And embarrassment lasts longer than bruises." Tony Torrino was never seen in New York again. Some said he fled to California. Others claimed he went back to Italy. But everyone agreed on one thing. He had learned the hardest way possible that challenging Bumpy Johnson required more than courage. It required understanding what you were really up against. For Bumpy, the night in the warehouse became the foundation of a legend that would last the rest of his life. Not because he had proven he could still fight, but because he had proven he didn't need to. In a world where respect was usually earned through violence, he had earned it through intelligence. In a culture that worshipped strength, he had demonstrated that wisdom was stronger. The boxing ring that had been set up to witness his humiliation became the stage for his resurrection. And from that night forward, when people talked about power in New York City, they didn't talk about who could hit the hardest or move the fastest. They talked about who was smart enough to win without fighting. They talked about Bumpy Johnson, February 18th, 1955. A young Italian mobster thought he could take a kingdom with his fists. Instead, he learned that kingdoms aren't conquered by warriors. They're ruled by kings. And Bumpy Johnson was still undeniably the King of Harlem,